Okay, so welcome to this special session focused on global climate dynamics and climate change as it really impacts the Southern Hemisphere and South nations. I'm Claudia Carr, and we're really privileged today to have Dr. George Leddy with us to address this really pressing topic. So I'd like to just briefly introduce Dr. Leddy to you. He is co-coordinator of the Sustainable Environmental Institute and at the Los Angeles Community College District. He is also a very long-term faculty member in environmental sciences in Los Angeles community colleges. Dr. Leddy has lectured to really broad gatherings of Los Angeles faculty members, college faculty members, and to a number of other meetings and gatherings concerning global climate dynamics. I should probably mention also that he's associate managing editor of Latin American Perspectives, which is a really preeminent political economy journal focused on Latin America. Dr. Leddy is formerly a lecturer in international development at UCLA and a scholar from the University of California at Berkeley. So no further delay, just want to welcome you, Dr. Leddy. We're really pleased to have you take time to talk with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Claudia, for that introduction. Yes, but I had a friend said, "Which degrees did you get at Berkeley?" And I said, "Oh, my BS and my MA and my PhD." He said, "Oh, you got the third degree at UC Berkeley." So, I'm going to do a screen share, which should take us to, but the first thing I wanted to share with you is actually something that is a current or recent publication. This is from the New York Times, and it's one of their storyboards that they've been doing. I think Logan, who's in the group here, knows a lot about these storyboards that now you can do, and they're very graphically appealing. This looks at the increase in rainfall and the monsoon, the majestic monsoon of the South Asian continent, Southeast Asia. And as you scroll through the argument, it shows you the article, it takes you through what the changes that are expected, in this case, increased rainfall. So what this points to is one of the features of what we call the climate crisis, or sudden anthropogenic climate change, is that the wet places will get wetter and the dry places will get drier. That is sort of the rule of thumb. So I do recommend this article. The monsoon is becoming more extreme, and I know that Maya is in the Mekong Valley, and a lot of this will actually hit her close to home. It has fantastic graphics in terms of the patterns. So to understand the monsoon in South Asia, Southeast Asia, we have to remember that the word itself, actually drawn, I think, from Arabic, means the season. So this is a period or a region of the world where the major wind patterns actually reverse every so many months of the year. So this reversal then brings moisture to the South continent, and that moisture builds up in the Himalaya and builds the snowpack of the Himalaya mountains and also the glaciers. So the role of the monsoon is critical to the livelihoods and the water supply and the agricultural systems of billions of people, stretching all the way from the Arabian Sea to the Philippines. So I highly recommend this article in the New York Times. It's interactive and it is very useful in an educational setting. It also has ample references. And I found this just today and thought I have to share this with the group because this really does address the issue that we're interested in today, which is to what extent is the impacts of the climate crisis as we know it uneven in the world, so that those places least responsible, if we want to use that word, for the amount of greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere today are the ones experiencing the most extreme effects. One example I can give for that is that we're having very freak weather in California, and my Los Angeles Times reports, on the front page that 4 people died in the San Joaquin Valley flooding. Buried deeper in the LA Times a few days ago was that 45,000 people have died in Somalia alone from the effects of displacement and the climate crisis, drought, and the disappearance of their animals. So our perspective of what happens when the climate crisis hits is often very parochial, very domestic, very local, and we don't really take into account the extent to which the climate crisis, if you live in what we call the global south, is much more pronounced, more exaggerated, more extreme than even this very strange freak weather that we're experiencing in California. So I wanted to start with that one because I think it's worth noting. It kind of sets us off in the right direction today. So here is, I hope this works. Will it work? Oh, no, it didn't. Oh, dear. Oof, okay, good old Zoom. They changed the rules. So this is what I want to focus on today is three things, actually. What are the meteorological or physical, natural processes involved in what we call the climate crisis? And then we want to look at those uneven impacts. Suffice to say that people don't actually typically, well, they did a survey a few years ago at UC Santa Cruz, and they surveyed graduating seniors, and they asked them about climate. Only 11% of graduating seniors at UC Santa Cruz 2 years ago had any climate literacy content in their curriculum, in their courses, in their area of study. Only 11%. Frankly, for a UC campus, that's unforgivable, particularly for UC Santa Cruz, which of course got the humongous drenching that we're witnessing today. So this shows us the inexorable march toward 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the bottom of what could be expected in terms of major dislocations on a planetary level. So if you're familiar with the organization 350.org, founded by Bill McKibben some time ago, their goal is to reduce carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere back down to 350 parts per million. That's how they got their name. Right now, we're at 420 parts per million. So the reality is we're going to blow right by 1.5. 350 parts per million of CO2 would keep us at that livable increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And while that might sound low, it isn't. It's actually quite extensive. When we look at the greenhouse gases, it's important to realize that carbon dioxide, while the most abundant, is actually the least heat trapping, so that methane and nitrous oxide have far more heat trapping capacity than CO2. That said, methane is not present in as much in terms of its concentration, but it does last a long time, and then it breaks down into carbon dioxide. So CO2 is the longest lasting of these, and methane is alarming because it's produced by many human activities like landfills and dairy cows and so on, but also it's sequestered in permafrost in the Arctic. And the Arctic today is one of the fastest thawing or heating areas of the planet. So we can expect high increases in methane with its 84 to 28 times more heat trapping capacity than CO2. It's the undiscussed gas until recent meetings that have taken place globally where methane has come up, because the human contribution to methane is quite significant. So that's why you see here that CO2 is responsible for 76% of what is the human-caused greenhouse contributions, but methane is right there at 16%, and it's actually increasing by quite a bit. And so looking at the long millions of years before the present, there was a period of cooling, and what we see is that, in fact, the more recent past, well, thousands of years ago, was actually cooler than even the baseline of zero, which you can see in this graph is somewhere between the hothouse and the cooling. But today, that we're now in that period that they're calling the end of the Holocene or the beginning of the Anthropocene. People can argue as to whether that is a useful nomenclature, but it stands to reason that in terms of geologic time frames, this period will have a lot of markings, a lot of indices, a lot of clues that something took place somewhere in the 19th and 20th centuries of human habitation that changed the trend from a cooling period to a rapidly heating period. The Earth has never heated up as fast as it is now. So that is actually quite alarming. We have had heating in the past, but it's taken tens of thousands of years. So if you have somebody who's a climate denier that tells you, what about Milankovitch cycles, or what about natural changes, remind them that what we are witnessing today has taken place in less than 200 years. And there's no natural phenomenon that we can look at other than an asteroid collision that takes place in less than 200 years. Just a little primer on, what is the relationship between the atmosphere, and you could say the hydrosphere and the cryosphere if we want to play geography here. So the hydrosphere being all the water, the atmosphere being all the gases, and the cryosphere being all the ice. So these are the normal positions of subtropical highs, and they're responsible for this very interesting and very important aspect, what affects a lot of South countries, the intertropical convergence zone. People like Claudia, who've done their research in Africa, are keenly aware of how fickle the ITCZ is and what that means for people that live in the relatively arid regions of the Sahelian belt, south of the Sahara, where depending on the ITCZ, they get rainfall or they don't get rainfall. So disruption of the ITCZ is in fact one of the effects that is now being studied scientifically in terms of what is anthropogenic climate change doing to these wind patterns, to these exchanges of heat and cold. So these are the typical lows and highs, and this is the path of major storms. Notice that South America does not get hurricanes until now. 3 years ago, Brazil had a hurricane, unrecorded. Today, Peru and Ecuador are having a hurricane, unrecorded. It's pouring rain in the west, on the very relatively arid desert regions of South America, the Peruvian desert, and well, Ecuador is more humid. So yes, there is definitely a change, not witnessed by people in their lifetime, so you'll often hear that. The other one I draw your attention to is the Indian Ocean, where yes, those typhoons or cyclones, as they're known there, have affected particularly that region you see right here between the very large island of Madagascar and the mainland countries of Mozambique and Malawi. An incredibly pernicious hurricane that got the name Freddie, which is, I think, one of the longest lasting hurricanes I have ever seen, but we'd call it a typhoon there, has found its niche between Madagascar and the mainland and bounced back and forth between Madagascar and Mozambique, causing incredible, unprecedented flooding, but picking up energy again from the warm water in between and remaining. It has lasted weeks and weeks. I think it's finally petered out, but not without even causing major flooding in Malawi, which is actually a landlocked country. So understanding these patterns is something you would get if you take a Geography 1 course. And so this is not a Geography 1 course, but I do want to just call attention to the fact that these cyclonic systems and these changes in wind directions and in cells are important to understand to what degree is an addition of energy in the atmosphere changing their dynamics, changing their traditionally viewed patterns, which we are seeing particularly with respect to that intertropical convergence zone. Some countries are experiencing this in a more extreme way than others, but here you can see, for instance, that the prevailing winds for the Northern Hemisphere are the trade winds and the westerlies. These are mirrored in the Southern Hemisphere. But the Hadley cells, which are the most stable and largest convection currents that basically circle the tropics, are in fact responsible for what we see today as El Nino. So the El Nino is an atmospheric phenomenon that has to do with ocean temperatures, and it has to do with these disruptions. It starts off the coast of Peru, but it affects weather all over the world. As far as the ITCZ in Africa, you can see that then this is its patterns, its seasonal patterns. It has a north normal, a south of normal, and that is what you're seeing there compared to the rain line and the ITCZ red dots. So it is, in a sense, migrating south. And that means that the very large populations of the Sahelian belt from Senegal to Ethiopia are experiencing big changes in their rainfall patterns. This is an interesting way to understand a very, very large continent, the difference between the higher altitude areas and the lowlands. Costa Rica was one of the few South countries to realize that they were actually experiencing a major change in their weather patterns as a result of deforestation. So Costa Rica began a reforestation program in the 1980s to avoid essentially the turning of their tropical forest into a savanna, which it was becoming quite quickly. So Costa Rica has gotten a lot of accolades globally for the steps they took to reverse a pattern that came a lot from deforestation. Deforestation in that case was run or was directed, was impulsado by cattle ranches. So that is something that Costa Rica has now changed economically. They depend a whole lot more on, say, ecotourism today than they do on beef exports, because indeed their cloud forest was drying out and the deforestation was really quite extensive. And so looking here, what you see is that the potential flooding is what affects approximately 2.5 billion people globally. And that is a very large part of the world. Here, what you see is, for example, the increased flooding that has happened in Bangladesh, the mouths of the Irrawaddy, And this is April 15th, 2008, and here's May 5th, 2008. Almost a complete wiping off of the so-called chores, the ephemeral islands that make up the deltaic region of Bangladesh. And they weren't in the past very populated because they represent such a natural hazard. But today, and they have been for decades now, a lot of landless people searching for land in Bangladesh have moved to those chores to experience typhoons that have wiped out their animals, in many cases wiped out the whole island. So what we see today, that's something we don't consider, is climate refugees. And in many ways, the war in Syria was in very large part due partly to climate change, because the drought that affected Syrian farmers led to their migration away from their farms into cities. And then the war dislocated them, and they began their very long treks from Syria all the way through Turkey and into seeking refugee status in Western European countries, which have not been hospitable to the Syrians, even though a lot of what's happened in Syria is in fact a consequence of everything from weapon sales and butting in of world powers like Russia and the US on one side or the other. But what we're looking at is increased aridification in those areas that are dry. And that is generally true of even the Western United States. So it's important to note the differences, the historical differences between North and South, to better appreciate what these impacts are really about. And so here there's just a few points of the historical dimensions, which have to do with economic systems that have been entirely structured along extractivism and the transfer of wealth from South to North that has enriched a lot of North countries historically and even fueled their industrial revolution. Following that, and following the wars of independence and the 1960s, neocolonialism has come to take the place where economic and political dominance is exerted without the direct colonial power making its presence felt. But those specific impacts on weather, climate droughts are disproportional in terms of reaching those southern regions, the many countries of the global South. The South, maybe if we wanted to name what it is, this map gives you an idea of the difference between what we call the global South and what we might call the global North. So it's clumsy in the sense that New Zealand and Australia are really part of the global North. But you can see that this encompasses most of the world's population and most of the world's biomes, that is, ecosystems that have such an important role in supporting the biodiversity of the planet. We don't have time to go into the whole issue of the sixth largest mass extinction, which we are witnessing as a result of the Anthropocene, but suffice to say that it's inextricably connected to the climate crisis. This article I sent to Claudia, it's in The Guardian, it's very short, but it does identify those places of the stark difference between North and South in terms of who is being hit. And so to appreciate the Industrial Revolution, this is basically just to point out something that I was very unhappy to see today. The Atlantic Monthly, or maybe it's not a monthly anymore, I read it, and somebody who I really like, Naomi Oreskes, she writes a lot about climate, and she wrote a lot about the tobacco industry. She does very good journalism. And suddenly, there she is joining this whole chorus of people that are saying, yeah, the climate crisis is, we just hate 8 billion people. That's it. 8 billion people are the cause of the climate crisis. And you have no idea how irritating I find that, because no, 8 billion people are not the cause of the climate crisis, and that's what I hope to show you next. The countries most responsible for the carbon dioxide present in the atmosphere today are in fact a handful of countries. And in fact, it's a smaller percentage of human population that is most directly responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions historically. That doesn't mean that today South countries, and particularly countries like China, haven't in fact joined and even surpassed the contributions made by those countries historically. But the accumulated carbon dioxide and methane concentrations in the atmosphere today do come from the richest countries, what we might call the OECD countries, the Western Europe, Japan, the United States. This shows you to what extent by income. So even within an advanced industrial country like the US, you find that the contribution made by the richest people by far outstrips the contribution made by working people, which you can see there under, say, $50,000 It's a lot less than those making more than $50,000. And what we eat has a lot to do with those contributions, so that even our diet and our assumption that we can go to Trader Joe's and buy anything, no matter where it comes from. Oh, look, grapes from Chile. Oh, look, wine from South Africa. We're so accustomed to that we don't question the globalization of food chains and the degree to which that demand on agricultural commodities and even some luxury foods has disrupted, of course, the local agricultural systems. I know that in this class, Claudia has talked extensively about that. So we don't have to touch on it except to remind ourselves that no, 8 billion people eating rice are not the cause of the global climate crisis. This is. I find this, I can't resist this slide, not only because of its raw patriotism. So we're supposed to look at this eyesore of ghastly chemicals and climate killing industry and put a big flag on it and salute. And of course, too many people in the United States do. But this is in fact what is driving the greenhouse gas emissions. You can see that by comparison, USA, Russia, China, and are above the world average, and Europe has been able to reduce its current greenhouse gas emissions thanks to their compliance with international treaties that the US has not. Neither has the UK. No, the UK has. So this is important to recognize, because when we consider emissions per person, the rich countries are still quite extraordinarily overrepresented. Now, countries that export oil are also in this, so that's why you might see Iran. It's a very narrow little strip there between Germany and Russia. But this is the fact, that the richest 10% of the population in the world is accountable for 50% of the CO2 emissions by world population. The poorest 50% is responsible for only 10% of the total lifestyle consumption emissions that lead to the climate crisis we're looking at. So that is really something that I like to show this graphic to people that tell me that 8 billion people are the reason why everything is messed up. And there was, I think it was called COP21, the Paris Accords, the ones that Trump tore up and then Biden then went and restored. The Paris commitments would have actually had us reach 3.3 degrees Celsius. We would, under the Paris Accords, we would even have surpassed the 2 degrees Celsius goal, which is actually already quite devastating. So lest we think that the Paris Accords were this great breakthrough, sadly they weren't. They were quite a compromise. It just took extremists like Donald Trump to find it unconscionable that the United States would comply by something so easy to comply with, which was the Paris commitments. Since then, we've had the COP27, and it did create something called the Loss and Damage Fund. But COP27 was a flop. That was in the Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And there is now a series of international climate conferences, starting with Glasgow, COP26, COP27, and coming soon, the United Arab Emirates is going to host COP28. So as Greta Thunberg points out, we should basically stop holding our breath for these international conferences. They have been run over by lobbyists. There were over 700 fossil fuel lobbyists at Sharm el-Sheikh, 700. And they have a seat at the table. They're given observer status, and they're given all kinds of breadth to participate. So in that sense, that particular road to change is being undermined by global capitalist companies and by banks. So this is the degree to which private banks are doing quite well, thank you very much, investing in fossil fuels, even when they deny it, as Chase Bank denied it, but they're one of the big five in terms of funding fossil fuels, the ongoing funding of fossil fuels that fortunately, we just had an event this last week, Third Act, where people my age went to some private banks and protested their funding of the fossil fuel industry. You might also know that there's moves in California to have the pension funds of public employees and teachers, that's CalPERS and CalSTRS, to divest the pension portfolio from those companies that are in the fossil fuel industry. It's actually quite controversial, but it would make an enormous difference, and it would set quite an important signal. So the climate change report that came out in 2021 there were two. The physical science basis was the first one, but what the takeaways were was that human influence is unequivocally warmed the planet. that the climate science is getting better, and that's why the models change, and it seems to drive the conservatives crazy. Yes, science models change. The more refined the data, the better the instrumentation, the more you refine the model. But no climate model has been debunked by any future finding. It just reinforces what we already knew. So the window that we've had is closing very rapidly, but it's very important to note that the most recent IPCC report, which was very well covered in the Washington Post, I might have sent Claudia that article, points that there are still many actions we can take before 2030 that would avoid the tipping points that the IPCC has warned about. The tipping point is where a process that's going on in natural systems is irreversible. So an example of a tipping point is Antarctica. The melting of ice in the glaciers in Antarctica are in fact irreversible. So at this point, we can anticipate very extreme sea level rise as those particularly large glaciers like Thwaites and Pine become part of the Southern Ocean. This is sort of a model on ways in which if nothing changes or if there are changes, aimed into 2030. So you can see that this model or this diagram was created somewhere around 2020, and it shows you that our current policies will have us really missing the mark in terms of the scenarios that have been presented. The 1.5 degrees Celsius is the green line at the bottom, and then there's the 2 degrees Celsius, that's this blue one. And so here we are barreling our way to 3 degrees Celsius, which is incredibly devastating when you look at what the models predict there. So that's the irony, in a way. It's maybe not an irony, it's a tragedy, that the two things are true. One is there is still a very strong opportunity to stop this process of adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and to the extent that we can sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere without using some complicated technology, that then we can actually hold where we're located. But that takes something that seems to be lacking, and it takes political will, and it doesn't take a technology that hasn't been invented yet. And that's an important thing to note. All the technological changes that we need to address the climate crisis are here today. We don't have to wait for some incredible thing like nuclear fusion to save us. We have all the technologies here today. And in fact, the renewables, particularly photovoltaic, solar, and wind, are now cheaper per kilowatt hour than the conventional sources like coal and oil. But this is from Al Jazeera, and it was from 2022, and it looks at the impacts on global South countries. So I did some research to find what is this impact.
Climate justice.
Climate justice now.
2 words that we hear more and more.
That climate justice is linked to racial justice, social justice, and intergenerational justice too.
This is why we call not only for climate action, but climate justice.
2 words that could define the century.
There is no climate justice without racial justice. There is no climate justice without gender justice. There is no climate justice without queer justice.
But what exactly does climate change have to do with justice? Aren't we all in this together? To understand climate justice, we need to understand climate injustice. Who causes climate change and who's hurt by it? Let's first look at who's responsible for putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and heating the planet. Imagine this grain of rice is 1 ton of carbon dioxide. Each year, the average person in Nigeria adds less than 1 grain into the atmosphere. The average person in India, 2 grains. In China, 7 grains. In Germany, 10 grains. In the US, 17 grains. In 1 year, the average American pollutes 20 times more than the average Nigerian. But the problem with carbon is that it stays trapped in the atmosphere for centuries. So it's not just about how much we add each year. It's about how much has piled up over time. Since 1850, that adds up to about 1,500 gigatons. Okay, so we wanted to pull loads of these rice bags on the table to show you how big that really is, but after doing the math, we realized we need 3 million of them. Historical emissions matter today because countries are arguing about how soon they have to cut their net emissions down to 0. Big polluters like China, India, and Brazil look a lot less guilty when you consider they've only recently become part of the problem.
The tendency is to quote the annual emissions, but that doesn't tell us anything about, why we are in the current mix.
This is Prakash Kashwan, a political scientist researching climate justice. He said the rich countries haven't accepted how unjust climate change really is.
It's mind-boggling, the kind of inequalities that have brought us to the current climate crisis. They're unbelievable and they aren't talked about enough.
In 2020, researchers calculated how far each country is responsible for pushing CO2 levels beyond a safe threshold that we crossed in 1990. The study takes into account how many people live in a country, how much they emitted throughout history, and includes emissions that cross borders through traded goods. The research shows that rich countries have outspent their carbon budgets by a lot. The global north has emitted 92% of the CO2 that pushed the planet beyond safe levels. Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America have emitted just 8%. Even a massive emitter like China is only just using up its carbon budget now. But if you live in a country that runs on fossil fuels, this doesn't mean climate change is your fault personally. But some of your choices do still make a difference. Because it's not just about where you live, but also how much you spend. The world's richest 1% emits twice as much as the poorest 50%, and those elites live all over the world. Unequal emissions are one big reason why climate activists are shouting about justice.
Everyone already is affected by the climate crisis, just on a very different scale. But if we look at the people ruling Germany and sitting at these decision tables for the past decade, they have not faced their responsibility.
They are destroying our environment. I think they need to act now, not later.
But hold up. CO2 heats the planet by the same amount whether it comes from Germany or Kenya. The climate doesn't care about geography. Well, geography cares about the climate. The second part of climate injustice is that even though poorer countries have done the least to change the climate, they're the ones getting hurt the most. Take heat waves and drought. Heat waves are becoming most unbearable across Africa, where droughts are even more punishing for crops. Then there's storms. Warmer air means that hurricanes and typhoons carry more energy and unleash more rain and stronger winds across the tropics. And by 2050, sea levels will have risen so high that floods which used to hit once a century will strike many coastal cities every single year. You can check out one of our other videos to see how some cities are trying to keep themselves afloat. The inequalities of climate change come together hardest in a country like India. Even those people have barely contributed to global warming, they're among the most vulnerable. India's coastal cities are facing unprecedented floods while its rivers dry up, leaving farmers struggling to grow staples like rice and wheat.
India is one of the most inequitable countries in the world, and what we can see is that even if you take a city like Mumbai, when floods happen in the city, it's the poor that are the most impacted.
This is Payal Parekh, a climate scientist who campaigns full-time for climate justice.
Having grown up in a country like India, I grew up with inequality all around me. And this is essentially what it comes down to. The world is very unequal, and it's playing out in terms of climate change as well.
But that inequality is found within rich countries too. Black and brown people in countries like the US or the UK are typically poorer than white people. And that means they have less money to spend on air conditioning to adapt to heat waves or flood insurance to rebuild after storms. So how can we make it fairer? Well, polluting countries can first turn off the CO2 tap and start removing their pollution from the atmosphere. Then they could pay reparations for using up more than their fair share of emissions. Some countries and companies are already doing something similar by paying poor countries to not chop down forests and instead plant trees. But instead of using that saved carbon to atone for their climate debts, they're using it as an excuse to keep on emitting.
So climate reparations have to be part of that discussion, and climate debt in particular is where we think about who is, we kind of divide up who is responsible for the kinds of ecological changes and climate changes we're seeing in societies, but also the kinds of climate-induced disasters that countries are facing.
This is Keston Perry, a political economist studying climate justice. He says reparations are needed to balance the scales, but that they won't be enough.
It is an interim measure. When I say that, I mean it has to be, we have to have a sort of much more longer term conversation around the economic system that we have nurtured and cultivated globally that have resulted in these kinds of disasters. And what do we do to not only reform that system, but absolutely overhaul it?
Reparations might sound radical, but rich countries already agreed to pay poorer ones to adapt to climate change. Imagine each of these pieces $1 billion US. Rich countries promised 100 of them each year in climate finance by 2020. But it's 2021 and they haven't popped up. In 2018, they gave 80 billion, but most of it was loans, not grants. UK-based charity Oxfam found that the real aid was actually closer to 20 billion.
Yearly, we have not been meeting the kinds of targets that even global north countries have set themselves. That finance mechanism is not meant to actually solve the problem.
Another approach takes climate justice more literally, holding polluters to account in court. After deadly wildfires tore through Portugal in 2017, 6 young activists took 33 industrial countries to the European Court of Human Rights for failing to cut their emissions quickly. They argued that the countries are discriminating against young people who will have to live with the consequences of climate change. The verdict is still pending. In Germany and the Netherlands, High Court judges have ordered their governments to up their ambitions on cutting emissions. Activists also won a case against Royal Dutch Shell, forcing the company to pay for oil pollution, and are now demanding climate-friendly investments too.
So the basic legal argument for assigning responsibility is your contribution to the problem. So how much do you emit? How much do you contribute to climate change, greenhouse gas emissions? And what is the possibility for contributing to the solution?
The defendants argue that national courts don't have the right to rule on the climate because emissions and their impacts are global. But a new generation of activists are fighting for them to take exactly that responsibility and give them climate justice.
People have no idea how unjust the climate crisis is. And that's why we're making videos about it every Friday to help you understand. So if you like what you saw, then
hit the like. So this shows you, I think it was a really, I know it was a 10-minute video and it was made in 2021, but the details of it and the discussion, the way it outlined the problem is really something I cannot match. So I thought I would just share it with you. That's from Deutsche Welle, which is sort of the PBS of Germany, and they have English language, French language service, etc. So there you see the cumulative emissions for CO2. The darker the color, the bigger the contribution. And the US does stand out in that regard. And then per capita CO2 emissions, in this case, that would include even less populated countries like Canada and Australia, but both are fossil fuel exporters. So the Canadian tar sands and Australian coal actually drive up their global part in the climate crisis. As the film mentioned, it's really about 7% of the global emissions are caused by the poorest 50% of the world, and 10% of the richest are responsible for over half. And this is from Climate Home News. I think I might have shared this one with Claudia last week, and it points out what is it that is being discussed from the global south? What is it they are demanding? And look at this map, and you can see that, in fact, by far the most vulnerable regions in the world are the South Asian continent and most of the African continent. The history, of course, lies in fossil fuel or extraction industries and colonization. There's too much text here. I don't read my slides when I share them, but it does point out that France occupied Madagascar for a period of time, a very long period of time, deforesting a lot of the island and using it as really an agricultural platform for global trade. As did Portugal and their colonies, not just Brazil, but of course in their African colonies. And so there is, in fact, this is from Carnegie Institute in Europe. And what drew me to the article was not only did it have, data, which I already shared with you on who's to blame, but also it went into some of the details of adaptation. This is a very mainstream organization, the Carnegie Foundation. So I have found that to some extent, some of these big think tanks that are very mainstream and even, quite corporate or based in New York, like Brookings and so on, have nonetheless taken on trying to analyze the problem, maybe sometimes softening not just the role. Well, I shouldn't say that. They actually do say whose responsibility is this. So the term climate colonialism comes to mind. I took a lot of the texts that I'm sharing with you in slides are taken from this particular article. It's a very, very well detailed in terms of both the problem and the solutions. So climate justice, what is it? And we can see that we've got a much better grasp of what that is after seeing the video clip that we watched. It's a concept that was really introduced to address the inherent injustices that are there even without the climate crisis. That is the history of colonialism, extraction, dislocation, the wholesale appropriation of resources in many South countries. So that remains a fact today. As you've probably noticed in this class, when you look at current land grabs, the process of anything has sped up. Particularly in Africa, where countries like Saudi Arabia and Israel and other richer countries are buying up land in Ethiopia and Kenya for their export platforms to basically supply their own domestic markets with agribusiness commodities that they grow overseas. This shows you how soon it will happen, or it's already happening, where South countries overtake the North countries' current CO2 emissions. So that would be particularly the rise of India and China as major global economic powers. So where are we in terms of the path to emissions? We've seen this in a previous slide. We are barreling toward 2.7 degrees Celsius, even with the current policies, even if they were actually implemented. So there is, in fact, from NASA, this interesting little clip.
Already feeling the effects of climate change. Intense heat waves, longer fire seasons, droughts and floods, the impacts of a warmer planet are all around us. And as global temperatures continue to rise, we'll experience even more changes to our planet. New NASA research suggests that with high greenhouse gas emissions, we'll see declines in global crop yields for maize, corn, as early as 2030. Shifting rainfall patterns, higher temperatures, and increased atmospheric carbon levels are likely to affect where and how much of staple crops like corn, soybeans, wheat, and rice can be grown. Using multiple highly accurate supercomputer models, researchers projected future global conditions based on greenhouse gas emissions. They ran these results through models that simulate how crops respond to changes in things like rainfall, temperatures, and atmospheric carbon dioxide. By using multiple computer models, the teams could compare results and be more confident in what they learned. Overall, corn and wheat showed the clearest results. By 2069 through 2099, global corn crop yields could decrease 24%. Corn is grown around the world, with large quantities grown in countries close to the equator. Rising temperatures in this region will put stress on those plants, leading to lower crop yields. Wheat, on the other hand, grows mostly in more temperate regions, like the northern US and Canada, North China Plains, Central Asia, Southern Australia, Europe, and Russia. Warmer global temperatures and higher atmospheric carbon dioxide could increase wheat crop yields up to 17%. However, these increases will likely level off by 2050 or so. Changes to our global agriculture are likely to happen relatively soon, even in scenarios where we significantly lower greenhouse gas emissions. The more we understand about how our global food systems will change in a warmer climate, the better prepared we can be.
Indeed. Well, when Americans say corn, they mean maize. But there you see a healthy corn crop, and there you see what happened just recently in the United States Midwest following a very hot period there, where what affects a lot of agricultural crops is actually the evaporation of soil moisture. So even if you're irrigating your crop, 110 degrees can basically bake the water right out of the soil and result in this kind of process. So to what extent are multilateral organizations and trying to address the North-South split? There have been, at least in 2021, doubling bilateral climate disbursements, increasing financial through multilateral concessions, tripling the level of multilateral development bank financing, and partnering with private sector actors to double private finance from 2018 to 2025. Notice how much of that, is pivots or orbits the financial institutions of advanced industrial countries and their multilateral development banks and their private banks. So that this is actually being perceived in a very cynical way as an opportunity for global finance, rather than, say, wholesale forgiveness of debt, which would probably be a better start. But this is actually going to expand their debt. The cap and trade system that has been allowed, which is what we have in California, remains debated because it means that you can game the system. And that's something that has been witnessed by those that started researching what are these carbon offsets. What is a carbon offset? If a company in the United States says that they bought 1,000 acres of Amazonian rainforest that they promised to leave in pristine condition, and that's their carbon offset. So there is something quite absurd with both the concept of net zero, which also involves this kind of offsetting. Net zero works fine when you're talking about a building. It does not work fine when you're talking about an advanced industrial economy. It's absolutely a ridiculous notion. But they do hope that you could then, through these instruments, which is what we have in California, find a way that you can have your cake and eat it too. So that you can go on being a polluter, you can go on contributing to greenhouse gases because, gosh, you offset your carbon by saving a forest somewhere in Canada. So research of this shows that, in fact, it's really quite bogus. It is a big failure. The whole concept of offsetting carbon is basically a scam. This just is a brief look at from the share. What I did want to show here is that the source is Our World in Data. I highly recommend it as a place to find graphic stuff up to date on every kind of issue you want to come up with, and it's totally free. You can download these diagrams and charts. They're well researched and they're all well referenced. So what are the solutions, if not, cap and trade and carbon taxing? Well, they're more complicated. And in fact, the loss and damages aspect of COP27 did point to something akin to restitution or reparations. And that really needs to be a net transfer of wealth and resources from north to south, and not presenting market opportunities for South countries to run up bigger debts in order to acquire the financing to build their infrastructure, their climate resilience. Keep in mind that the recent flooding in Pakistan last year flooded 30% of the country. Pakistan's a big country. Imagine 1/3 of Pakistan underwater. In fact, so much of it is still there. It's still draining, and it destroyed everything: cities, schools, farms. Pakistan is still heavily affected by what happened in that incredible monsoon, and yet it moved off the radar. I think maybe Antonio Guterres has brought it up a few times that the world has not met its responsibilities or its promises to help Pakistan deal with what happened there. So what are climate solutions? Well, a lot of them, I think, involve maybe paying closer attention to all of the technologies that we already have, and paying closer attention to who is in the best position really to act on two things: biodiversity protection and climate appropriate technology. And what we don't consider is to what extent indigenous people in the world, and there are a lot more of them you'd think, actually control, at least technically or juridically, very significant swaths of land that have some of the richest biodiversity and that represent some of the biggest challenges when it comes to drought and flood. So that I know that in Claudia's class, you actually have seen the importance of understanding what indigenous cultures are about, that they are modern people. They are not relics that belong in a museum. They aren't traditional people that are unable to modernize. Quite the contrary, their persistence in the world is a testament to their very sophisticated ways of coping with natural systems, so much so that it has allowed them to survive even when larger so-called civilizations have come and gone. So with that, I want to, I'm hoping I ended on time here. Claudia said 45 minutes. I thought I can race through this in 45 minutes. So I'll stop the share. And let me see. I hope that you could actually see that on your screen. My Zoom betrays me at times. It puts a little green thing, and then if I go full screen, it keeps the little green thing. Technology. We are at its mercy. So that is my cursory research into the asymmetrical relationship between North and South countries, both in terms of generating the problem and in terms of coping with it. So that we talk a lot about what are we going to do in California to deal with floods, but we don't talk about what are we going to do to stop the deforestation of the Amazon or the flooding of India.